comes to God and the Bible. And so we spent some time talking about that, how that he does require authority, expects us to obey him. And then we took at least 2 or 3 weeks talking about inspiration. Because when we talk about authority, we know that it's inherent in God, Father, and he, of course, has committed all authority, Matthew chapter 28, at this point, to the Son. But, of course, when Christ left, he left his 12 apostles who were inspired, and there were other first-century prophets who were also inspired. And they, of course, in turn penned the New Testament, which is, our authority during this dispensation, during this covenant, and will be so until the end of the age or the end of the world. And so we talked about, in addition to that, the fact that the New Testament sets out a pattern for us. And we talked a little bit about this idea that's sometimes ridiculed. Some refer to it as pattern theology, but the fact of the matter is the Bible does set out a pattern. In fact, God has always patterns. That is for us to follow. He did so in the Mosaic dispensation. Certainly has done so in the New Testament. Then we looked at the meaning of biblical faith. We understand that the way the term faith is defined in the secular world is not the biblical definition. Frankly, the way the term faith is defined in the denominational world is not the biblical definition. Biblical faith involves knowledge, it involves knowing, it involves evidence. It's not a blind leap in the dark, and so forth. And so we talked, a couple of weeks, a pretty good amount of time on that definition of biblical faith. Is it possible to know, and how does that all work together? Then we looked at what I called some basic or general principles of biblical interpretation, or the Deaver in his little book calls it significant distinctions, which we looked at various areas. When you're trying to determine what the Bible is teaching, what God wants us to adhere to, there's several things we need to understand. Number one, we need to understand what covenant you're living under, whether that applies to you or not. But there's a lot of other things, culture, whether it's cultural or not. We talked about faith and opinion, temporary and permanent, incidentals and essentials, if you will, all kinds of things. Culture and custom as opposed to law. And so we looked at several of those ideas. And then in the last couple of weeks we've been looking at, well, first about 3 weeks ago we talked about how the Bible does not authorize. God does not authorize. There's a lot of ways in which he doesn't authorize. He doesn't authorize based upon our personal likes or dislikes, or what we think will be the best way to do something, what's popular, so forth. And the last one we discussed, and we discussed in detail, is the issue of silence. What does God's silence do? And we saw that God's silence, we don't have the luxury of assuming anything when it comes to his silence. You recall the Syrophoenician woman that approached Christ. He responded to her with what? How did he respond to her request? Now, what was his first response? Silence. Silence was his response. That was the response she got. And his disciples, his apostles, assumed that they knew what he meant with his silence, and they did not. And therefore, we don't have that luxury to assume anything about God's silence, that he somehow approves or disapproves. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if he's silent on a subject, we can't assume that he's indifferent toward it, is the point. If he's silent toward it, then he's not giving us authority to act in that area. And so we talked about that quite a bit, that he does not authorize in that way. So how does he authorize? And we spent the last couple of weeks looking at these different areas. First at example, and then implication, Not because we infer something, but the fact of the matter is, wherever you have explicit statements, frankly, whether it's by God or anybody, those explicit statements are going to also imply other things. We talked about geometry, for instance. That must necessarily be true. And so we looked at that. And then we talked about direct statements. We didn't spend a whole lot of time on this. I think most of us understand what a direct statement is. But we did point out the fact that based on the Greek grammar in the New Testament, it's a little narrow to say we're talking about all the time, we're talking about command. A command is an explicit statement. It is a direct statement. But there are a lot of other types in the New Testament which may or may not authorize us to act in a particular way as far as our religion is concerned. Then, of course, if you have one of those three areas, if you have an example or implication or direct statement, then depending upon how general or specific that mode of authorization is, then there's going to be some human judgment involved. Maybe a lot, maybe not so much, depending upon how specific those other areas are. And then when it comes down to human judgment, then we're talking about what? Expediency, right? And if something is truly an expedient, then it is authorized. Okay? But expediency is not established on its own. In other words, I can't just do anything I want to and say, well, it's expedient that I do that. I first have to have these other areas, one of these other ways of authorization. And then there may be an expedient, or some more than one expedient that goes along with that. So, as we were talking last week, for instance, in that realm of expedience, it's very important. I mean, sometimes we can become very, we all have our opinions about maybe the way things should or should not be done. But certainly in the area of expediency, as far as congregationally, now as far as individually goes, you're entitled to act or not act based upon your opinion if it falls in an area that's authorized. But congregationally, those decisions are left up to the eldership, because the elders, frankly, don't have any authority when it comes to changing God's word. I mean, it is what it is. It says what it says. And so the areas have that authority. So if I don't like a particular decision, that's fine as long as I understand that just because I don't like it doesn't mean that it's somehow unauthorized. And that's where we run into trouble. So I gave the example last week of Sister Newsom, who came to one time and wanted to talk about something she didn't like, and I said, well, this is not a matter. It's not a matter of being unscriptural. And that's really what we're asking, is it scriptural or unscriptural? And she said, well, I know that. You guys don't like it. Okay. I can buy that. So, I had a member tell me last week, well, as long as we're talking about things like that, I don't like it when you chew on your glasses while they're in class. I'm trying not to chew on my glasses. So there's a lot of things that you like, I like, don't like. But that doesn't really answer the question. And frankly, as I pointed out last week, again, sometimes we jump to conclusions and we'll say, well, the denominations are doing that. Well, that doesn't really answer the question either. Now, the question is it authorized? Is it scriptural? Is it unscriptural? Those are the questions we need to be asking. That's the whole point. Somebody says, well, I mean, you mean I can't point that out? Well, no, I'm not saying that. Because when it comes to expedience, well, the eldership might decide that something we could do, but maybe we won't do because the denominations are doing it, and we don't want to be. Maybe that might cause some confusion. Then maybe it's not an expedient. It's not something we want to do. We don't want to cause confusion. We don't want to think people think we're like that. That doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. So, as I mentioned before, I suspect that most of the things that we have here physically that we know are expedients when it comes to worship and assembly, I suspect the denominations had before we did. Because they've been around longer than the Restoration movement in this country, and frankly, they've always had more money. And they've always been willing to do things quicker than we do. So I suspect they had doors and windows before. I suspect they had carpet and air conditioning before we did. And I know they had better technology than we had. But sometimes we didn't have it, maybe because we couldn't afford it or whatever. Sometimes we had it because people just said, well, we'll be like the denominations. That's not the right question. You're not asking the right thing. The question is it authorized? And is it if it's authorized, then the next thing the elders need to ask themselves, is it an expedient? Is it expedient for us to do this? Is there some advantage to it? And so for years and years and years, I heard Brother Glenn Wilson complain about singing. Because with psalm books, he complained, what did people do with their psalm book when they sang? Here's the way people sang. And he would say, hold your book up and sing over the top of your book. The problem is these books get heavy after a while, especially holding it with one hand. I know, because that's what men do their whole lives. Is they hold it for their girlfriends and their wives. And especially when you turn it over to one end, to one, this side or the other side, and you're holding it like that, well, that side gets kind of... So we finally got something that takes care of that problem. Where people don't have to sing like this. They can sing like this and project their voices, but people would complain. That's like the denominations. We're not asking the right questions. And then you know what happened is some of those people that complained after we got it up there thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And this is fabulous. I don't have to hold that heavy psalm book anymore. It's expedient. I know it's a simple example, but yeah.
The converse of that, there are some folks that don't like the technology. They want to hold the book.
And you can hold your book. See, that's the thing. We didn't take the books out.
Right.
The books are still there. See how smart this eldership is? Some people, their eyesight, they might not can see the screen, but they can see the book. I don't know. We try to be. And, we've got so sophisticated, we got these little pieces of unleavened bread in the tray for people that
Can't break it off.
arthritis has gotten so bad they can't break it off. Now they can just pick up a little thing, How about that? Yeah. It's been broken. Well, anyway, talking about these areas, and we can't just spend an inordinate amount of time on it. Again, I recommend to you Brother Warren's book, When is an Example Binding? It goes through all these things and gives a multitude of examples that are worth your study. But the other thing that I mentioned last week that I didn't want to be confusing on was this idea of legalism. I think maybe I left it a little confused after I got some questions after class. So I pulled out this old book that I read about 20 years ago. I forgot how good it was. But Piloting the Strait by Dave Miller. And I would highly recommend that to you. But he's got a little chapter in here on legalism. It's 3 pages, alleged legalism. What is legalism? Is legalism to be equated with too much concern for obedience? That's the charge, right? You people who want to obey. You people that want to follow the rules, you people that want to obey God's commands, that want to know what's authorized and what's not, you're a legalist. And the idea is you're a legalist because you're too interested in rule keeping. Well, is that what legalism is? Is that equivalent to just trying to keep God's commandments? Well, obviously it's not. Because there's way too many verses in the New Testament that tell us what? Old and New Testament that tell us what? For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments. And His commandments are not burdensome or grievous. He that says, that I know Him, but does not keep His commandments is a what? Liar. If you love me, keep my commandments. Right? Over and over again, the New Testament stresses, both our Lord and the writers of the New Testament stress the way we show our love for God is by our fidelity to His Word. He became the author of eternal salvation unto who? All them that obey Him. So that's not legalism. Trying to obey the commandments is not legalism, obviously. Yeah. Do you have something? Or are you just resting your glasses on
Rest my glasses.
Oh, okay. So, their idea is, as one preacher put it 20 years ago, we don't sweat the small stuff. Well, Jesus said, look, you should have done these things, not leave the other undone, but do these things also. Brother Miller says, legalism in its negative classical usage entails trusting one's own goodness. And so the focus is upon the attitude. God has always condemned the person who's proud of his obedience and thinks that he's pulling himself up by his own bootstraps, as we like to say. But He's always commended the person who maintains absolute fidelity to His commands. The difference, of course, in these two people is attitude. So when we talk about the Pharisees, aren't they generally the ones that we look at as the best example of legalists? Why? What are some reasons? Number one, he says, they were hypocrites. Remember, Jesus said what? You say and what? Do not. They didn't follow through with loving obedience. Number two, they gave attention to some biblical matters, the ones they liked, and neglected others. Well, people do that all the time, right? Number three, they misinterpreted Mosaic law and, of course, went about creating their own human traditions and interpretations, which were in direct contradiction of the law itself. Jesus said, look, the law says honor your father and your mother. You've come up with this tradition where you can get around that. And say, well, I've dedicated that to God, therefore I don't have to take care of my parents. So, legalism, when looking at those things, does not have anything to do with fervent attention to keeping the letter of the law. And so, we're talking about faithfulness. When they make the charge, when people nowadays make the charge that you're a legalist, really what they're saying is you're faithful. You're trying to keep the commandments. So, it's a smokescreen, as he says, from those who want to depart from the faith. I mean, I suppose maybe there are people today whose attitude is such that they're proud of their obedience. Maybe they are maybe they do have a holier than thou attitude. I'm better than you. But I don't know too many people like that. I don't think, not in the church. So when I said last week that, in fact, the opposite is true as far as legalism is concerned, we're not the legalists, we're just trying to keep the commands. The point I was trying to make is, it seems sometimes to me that they're the ones that are more concerned about splitting hairs in order to make themselves feel better. And I gave the example of the lady with the microphone. Okay? Where I was at, and they had a couple of guys, 2 or 3 guys on stage with microphones. Like I said, if that's all it had been, I don't know that I could have said a whole lot, because I don't know that I'm limited. We're limited to one song lead. You got a big crowd, I suppose. And if everybody's singing, well, what happened was they had a lady on the second pew or so that had her microphone so that she could stand out above everybody else. Well, in that case, yeah, I got a problem with that. But what I'm saying is their idea was we can split hairs. In other words, it's kind of like, I want to ask the question, do you think you're fooling God? Is that the point here? You're going to stand before God and He's going to say, well, you had a woman leading in the worship assembly. Oh, no, we didn't. See, she was on the second row. She wasn't behind the pulpit, or she wasn't standing here leading and singing. We had her on the second row, so she wasn't leading. Really? Is that the way you think that's going to work? You hand her a microphone? So that was my point about the ones that generally charge us with legalism seem to me to be the ones many times that are trying to get around these things.
Legalism also include the tendency or even the action of finding where God is not.
Yeah, and that's what, and certainly, yeah, certainly the Pharisees did that with they would find their traditions, what they had come up with, their interpretation, really, of the law. You know, they had all those rules about, you know, about work on the Sabbath, for instance. Well, all the Bible says is you can't work on the Sabbath. Well, they had all these rules about how far you could walk on the Sabbath, what you could do on the Sabbath. And notice, of course, that if their beast, which was crucial to their livelihood, if their beast fell in a pit on the Sabbath, well, could they lift it up or not? Yeah, absolutely they could. But then they charged Jesus and His disciples with breaking the Sabbath law for things not anywhere close to that. So, yeah, they were binding their tradition on the people. And so, yeah, even today, if we talk about, we mentioned this earlier, and I didn't mention this as I was going through kind of reviewing where we had been, but we talked about the difference between liberalism and what we call anti-ism or radicalism. Liberalism being that where you loosen where God is bound. Anti-ism or radicalism being that where you bind where God is not bound. And that's really where I think, you know, some of us can get into trouble. We certainly have whole congregations that can try to bind, but sometimes individually we try to do that, right? I have a particular issue with something and I try to bind that on other people. We do a lot of that. We do that. I tell you, you know where we do most of that? I'm not on it, but just from what I hear. We do most of that binding on Facebook. Everybody's got an opinion about whatever it is, and whether you should do it or not. And so we have to be careful about that. A lot of binding going on Facebook. I can tell you that, at least from what I hear. But I'm giving some examples. It would be the same, for instance. Well, here's a good example. The education of our children is a function of what particular institution? The home. Well, you've got 3 major institutions given to us by God that keep order in this world. And the very first one given was the home. It is the foundation of society. And that's why our society's crumbling. You then have civil government. Finally, you have the church. And I remember I read a book by Kerry Duke called Locks and the Theater. It does a good job of delineating those 3. And how sometimes we like to believe one over the other. And one institution likes to try to do something that the other one was set up to do. And so we have to be careful in that area. You're a parent, I'm a parent. You educate your children however you feel you think's best. I, as an elder, am not going to tell you what you have to do and not do. But we've got plenty of people that are willing to tell you in the church. I'll say plenty, but we've got enough that will tell you you have to educate your children this way. Whether it's public school, private school, home school, whatever. Everybody's got an opinion. That's fine. You take care of your family. Let this person take care of his family. I'll take care of my family. And so forth. But we can get into these areas and these discussions and then start, next thing you know, we're binding our opinions on other people. Brother Tom brought up last week about music in the church, and we were using that, of course, as one of our examples when it comes to expedience and silence and all that kind of thing. But if I go into Colossians 3:16 and Ephesians 5:19, I know that the pronouns there are reciprocal and reflexive in the New Testament Greek, which tells me what. Everybody's supposed to be engaged in this activity. Doesn't necessarily mean simultaneous every word. Else we have to get rid of a lot of songs in our, the men start, or the women start, and the men. But we're all involved in the same activity. So there's no authority in those verses for choirs or entertainers. Somebody's in the fellowship hall. I know that sound. So, it's a corporate activity. So therefore, no authority for choirs and special singing groups in the assembly, right? But then there's other areas too that we get into besides just that. For instance, we talked about the difference between vocal and non-vocal music. But even under those two, there are different things, right? I talk about vocal music. That includes singing, but what else does it include? Humming, whistling, right? Non-vocal music, we talk about mechanical instruments of music, but there's also, we can make noises with other parts of our body. But the question, are those things authorized? Well, it depends on how specific the command or general the command is. And the command actually is pretty specific in this circumstance. It says what? Singing. And we understand the reason for that because when I go to those verses, what does it tell me that I'm doing? I'm obviously worshiping God, but what else am I doing? I'm teaching and admonishing. In psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Well, it's awful hard to teach somebody something with clapping or snapping of fingers or humming or whistling. What am I teaching? What am I admonishing? See? When in fact, what those things are an appeal to kind of our worldly or secular impulses, right? Because when I listen to secular music, even good secular music, I'm not talking about dirty music, I'm just talking about good music. What do I want to do sometimes? Clap my hands and stomp my feet if I'm a country person. Like on hee-haw. So I may want to do some of those things because the music appeals to my senses. But that's not what God's asked for. It's not what He's commanded. So we have to look at all of those things and say, are they authorized or not? And of course, again, as we mentioned last week, the instrument It's two different kinds of music. It's not an aid or expedient. It's just like seeing and hearing are not the same thing. They're two different senses, right? So if I need an aid for seeing, what am I going to get? I may get glasses, I may get contacts. If I need an aid for hearing, though, I'm not going to get glasses or contacts. What am I going to get? I'm going to get a hearing aid. Because they're two different kinds of senses. And it's the same with music. Vocal, not vocal, that's two different things. Instruments is a different kind of music. It's not an aid. So, but we have to make sure that, what about applause? Do I have any authority for applause? Like when Barry gets through speaking this morning. If I like his sermon, should I clap? They do that in the denomination. Should I? What's my authority in the Scriptures if I'm going to do anything at the end of anything? An amen, which means I'm what? Approval or agreement with, but not applause. Here's another area, female leadership. He talks about in here, which is pretty good. We'll not spend a lot of time on this, but here's the latest thing in some of our churches, even some in this area. Well, we're not going to have female preachers yet, or elders, although some churches have gone that far. So how are we going to start that? How am I going to start getting the women leadership thing going? Not even prayer, no, that's too far. I won't do that. Huh?
Serving in communion.
Making announcements, that's going on in the city. We've got women making announcements because he says it's not part of the worship. It's not one of the 5 acts of worship.
I think a good example is the lady in the front row with the mic.
Yeah.
That's how things get.
But even that, though, is a little bit further than I think. We're making announcements, and then somebody else mentioned passing out the communion trays. But the leadership issue, of course, is more than just worship. I mean, there's more than one way to determine leadership. Sometimes it's determined by your position. Am I in a position of leadership standing here? Absolutely, because I'm controlling this class. But we do those little things to try to, basically what we're doing is getting people used to the idea of the female standing in front of the whole group, so that when that day comes that we decide we're going to let them say the prayer or lead the singing or preach the sermon, then they're already used to it because they've already been standing up before us, engaged in areas that they've never done before, right? And so sometimes I'm trying to figure out how to say this. Sometimes people will come with this objection when we do something. Well, that will lead to this. That will lead to something else. And I think we have to be careful with that. Because I think sometimes that is true. And it's an obvious thing. You see where people are going. But that's not the end of the matter, the total answer. Sometimes we throw that out just because we don't like something. I mean, that's kind of used as a catch-all. Well, it might lead to this. Well, the question still goes back to what? Is it authorized or not? So, this idea, well, it might lead to that. Well, the problem is with this woman thing, I don't think that's authorized at all. It's not a matter of what it will lead to. Shouldn't be doing it anyway, period. So, that sometimes can be helpful to to ask that question, what might it lead to, but it doesn't always answer the question. Because sometimes people throw that out just because they don't like something.
Correct.
Yep.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Say the preacher didn't make it, and it's just a congregation of women. If the congregation of women do all the 5 tenets of worship because there's no man present, is that still honorable worship?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I think so. I mean, I think they don't have any choice. I don't know where that would be.
It happened at where my grandmother was, and the preacher got sick and didn't show up because they no longer.
And he was the only man?
Yep.
Wow. Well, we've certainly had students go to congregations in the past. I don't think we see it as much anymore, but, you know, we used to have students that would go out to congregations in rural areas, rural Arkansas or Mississippi, in some community where there was like 10 women. That's all that was left. And, you know, of course, when the student goes, he being the only man, he has to do it all. But certainly, if there was no men there, then I would expect them to worship.
Or if the men weren't members of the Lord's church.
Well, that could be another problem, too. I think about that one. Yeah. Think about that one. You got an opinion on that? Male leadership goes beyond just the church, though. Male leadership is rooted in creation. That's why we can't get around it. That's why the liberals don't understand why it's not, you know, Paul and Timothy went back to what? Went back to creation. And he's saying, look, the deal is the woman was first in transgression, that's true. But what actually happened there in the beginning was the man advocated a spiritual role. His wife took leadership. His wife took headship of that situation and said, I'm going to make a spiritual decision for our home. And Adam didn't do it. Yeah, and I suppose you could have a congregation of women. I mean, they could have children there. Obviously, always there. They could lead the worship.
In the case of all-woman congregation, if a man visitor comes, would it be appropriate for women to ask the man to lead? Would it be essential?
I would probably, you know, and again, we may be getting into areas of opinion, but I might feel a little more comfortable with that. If I've got a male there, I realize he's not. And sometimes, I guess this is the point I'm making. People misunderstand. Just because a young man is baptized doesn't make him a man. We've had people complain in years past because, I don't mean here, I just mean in church. I mean, people get bent out of shape. They say when you get to the 5th and 6th grade class, you got to have male teachers. Why? Well, some of the young men might be baptized. Oh, really? So he's a man. You're telling me when he goes home, he's going to tell his mother, I'm a man now. You can't tell me anything. Because that's what you're saying. If you're saying that a woman can't teach him in a class because he was baptized and he's 12 years old, and you tell me that he can go home and his mother can't tell him anything either, he's not a man. And so I got a problem with that idea that somehow when someone's baptized, that makes them a man. I don't know where we got that idea. Yeah.
What point did you become a man?
That's a good question. You know, in Joshua's day, he became a man when he was 20 years old. In our country, we generally say they're 18. But a lot of 18 years olds aren't men or women. Yeah. Obviously, at some point, you got to be careful about that. All I'm saying is that I got a hard time saying that 11 or 12-year-olds are men. I'm not saying it's an easy line to define. Yeah.
It is safe though for the male to teach him it.
Absolutely, but I don't think it's unsafe for a woman to teach him at all, one bit. I have no problem saying that. Anybody want to start with me? Have that. But if you tell me that, I'm going to tell you that his mother cannot tell him what to do. Absolutely. It's the same thing. I've had people say that. I say, okay, so when they go home, what are you going to do? About when you go out of town, is he really the man of the house? He's in charge. Mom, don't tell him anything. It's the same concept. What I'm saying is that baptism, becoming a Christian, is not the same thing as men being a man or a woman. That concept goes back to the beginning.
Hey,
It
Brad,
has nothing to do with the church, yeah,
I think if,
per se.
I think part of it, the problem there with people thinking that is they're thinking about when the Jewish boy was 12 years old.
Yeah,
he
bar
had-
mitzvah.
He had to begin to worship, like a male.
Right. But did he go home and tell his mother, I'm not under your authority anymore?
But he still wasn't a man.
Absolutely not, he didn't. I agree with you. I'm not saying that I'm gonna run out and put a bunch of women in the 5th and 6th grade class. I'm saying, if they are, it's not gonna bother, I'm not gonna lose any sleep.
Or as a matter of expediency, there's a line at some point where the woman can no longer teach the male. Matters of expediency, sometimes the elders will draw that.
Absolutely.
Over 14 years of age.
Yeah.
That's a matter of.
Absolutely. I think when they get into junior high, high school, as a matter of expediency, we say, we're not gonna have females teaching these kids. But in the younger ages, I think that's up to, I guess the point is, it's up to an individual eldership of that congregation to decide what is expedient for us.
It's sort of like short dresses. I may not know where the line exactly is, but I know when it's.
Well, it's like and I don't remember who did this, but it's like the Supreme Court justice said, I can't define pornography, but I know when I see
When
it.
I see it, yeah.
It's an expedient, you're right, in that way. Here's what we're going to do next week. We have not had a textual study in here in a while. I think the last book we did was Hebrews. So I think we'll stay in that area of the Bible and look at what's known in the denominational world as the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. We can argue whether that's a proper name for those. They usually call them the pastoral epistles because they think of preachers as pastors, and these books were written to preachers. However, there is information in these books on pastors. So, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. What we'll pick up with next week.
So that starts
Next Sunday. I'm not going to wait till the next quarter.
Okay.
That starts in a couple of weeks. I've said all I want to say on this. Sorry.